The Civil War was a major turning point in United States history, but what was the turning point of the Civil War? That's what I'm here to answer. There's lots of debate about what is to be considered the turning point of the Civil War. Some of these include the Confederate victory at the First Battle of Bull Run, the Confederate invasion of Kentucky, Albert Sidney Johnston's death, Fort Sumter, the Battle of Antietam, the death of Stonewall Jackson, the Battle of Gettysburg, and the Emancipation Proclamation. There are many different arguments supporting each of these events, but there are a few arguments to focus on. Fort Sumter, the Battle of Antietam, the Battle of Gettysburg, and the Emancipation Proclamation. Right after the Confederates seceded, they couldn't capture immediately. Right after secession, they had begun to capture forts for the Confederate Army to occupy a lot of territory along the border. Fort Sumter was occupied by a Union officer who didn't want to surrender the fort to the Confederates. When he didn't surrender the fort, the Confederates fired upon it. The firing lasted for 2 days. The Union would later surrender the fort because they didn't have any food or water and could no longer fight. Abraham Lincoln asked upon the citizens of the Union states to enlist into the Union Army. This really made the Union realize that the Confederates were a problem. The Confederacy will do much worse later in the war, making this argument invalid. One thing that happened later on in the war was the Battle of Antietam, which took place on September 17, 1862, in Sharpsburg, Maryland. It is considered to be the first major battle of the Civil War and the bloodiest day in American history. Multiple units of the Union Army attacked from different directions, leaving the Confederates incredibly vulnerable. When lunch came around, a Confederate division came over from Harper's Ferry and launched a surprise attack to counter the Union. This drove back Union troops and ended the fight for the day. Between both sides, there were over 22,000 casualties. Both were also dismayed by the day of fighting. This battle halted the Confederate invasion of Maryland, yet the Confederates were able to retreat to nearby Virginia. Antietam is still considered a Union victory, but not one that had a lasting effect on the war, therefore not a big turning point. Directly after the victory at Antietam, President Abraham Lincoln unveiled the Emancipation Proclamation. This changed the status of over 3 million slaves to free instead of slave. This meant that if the slaves either escaped the Confederacy or were freed by the Union, they were considered to be free men. After slaves were freed, they could go on to do many different things, such as start their own businesses or enroll into the armed forces. The armed forces are where a lot of them ended up. They wanted to support the army that helped free them. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't compensate slave owners, nor did it end slavery. It only freed those who were in rebellious areas. This didn't grant citizenship to ex-slaves, but called them freedmen. By instating the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln made ending slavery a primary war goal. This sparked outrage in the Confederate States. British and French support was soon to arrive, yet with the instatement of the proclamation, the British and French backed out their support. This infuriated the Confederates because if they had the support of these powerful countries, they could have easily defeated the Union. Although the emancipation changed the war, it still didn't make enough change to be considered the biggest turning point of the war. There is a turning point in every war. For instance, during the Battle of Vietnam, the Tet Offensive specifically, the tide and momentum shifted. This is when the Viet Cong attacked the Southern Vietnamese army on the Vietnamese holiday of Tet, which is the Vietnamese New Year. The Southern Vietnamese were so surprised by the attacks and very demoralized that they would attack on such a holiday. Although the Southern Vietnamese and Americans fought back, they still lost a few cities as well as a lot of morale. The loss of these cities could have helped the South Vietnamese and Americans, but we will never know because they ended up losing in the end. The Battle of Vicksburg and Gettysburg is what I consider to be the biggest turning point of the Civil War. These two battles changed the momentum of the war to favor the Union, and this is what led them to victory. The victory for the Union at Vicksburg let them split the Confederacy. They could easily intercept supplies coming from Texas to support the war. Vicksburg also gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, which was one of the main transportation routes for soldiers and supplies to get to the front lines. Vicksburg was right before Gettysburg, and that is why they are commonly linked together. Vicksburg being from May 18th to July 4th, 1863, and Gettysburg lasting from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863. Gettysburg was meant to be a show of the Confederate Army's might. The Confederates were trying to enter Maryland and Pennsylvania when they met the Union Army. At first it was a light skirmish, and it quickly escalated to a furious battle for 3 days of constant gunfire. After many casualties, Robert E. Lee's invasion was repelled as they retreated back to Virginia. Lincoln believed that if the retreat was intercepted, the Civil War would have come to an abrupt end. Still, many civilians and soldiers of the North viewed Gettysburg as a great battle. Yet little did they know that the war would go on for 2 more years. Yet with both of the Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, morale was very high, and the Union realized that they had the upper hand in this conflict. To further the impact of these battles had on the Confederates, war bonds quickly fell out of the market, leaving little funding left for war. I quote, "European investors gave the Confederacy approximately a 42% chance of victory prior to the Battle of Gettysburg and Vicksburg. News of the severity of the 2 rebel defeats led to a sell-off in Confederate bonds. By the end of 1863, the probability of a Southern victory fell to about 15%. Unquote. Through the negative impacts that these battles had on the Confederates and the ever-increasing positive impacts that they had on the Union, I believe that it is safe to say that Gettysburg and Vicksburg were the biggest turning point in the Civil War.